Hello, YouTube. Today we're going to be picking back up on page 47, section 3. We'll be going through about 20 pages. Looks like we have some graphics coming up, but we'll try to get to page 68. There's a nice section break there. Maybe we'll get further, who knows? 3. The negation of the autonomy of art by the avant-garde. In scholarly discussion up to now, the category autonomy has suffered from the imprecision of the various subcategories thought of as constituting a unity in the concept of the autonomous work of art. Since the development of the individual subcategories is not synchronous, it may happen that sometimes courtly art seems already autonomous, while at other times only bourgeois art appears to have that characteristic. To make clear that the contradictions between the various interpretations result from the nature of the case, we will sketch a historical typology that is deliberately reduced to 3 elements: purpose or function, production, reception, because the point here is to have the non-synchronism in the development of individual categories emerge with clarity. A. Sacred art. Example: the art of the High Middle Ages serves as cult object. It is wholly integrated into the social institution religion. It is produced collectively as a craft. The mode of reception also is institutionalized as collective. B. Courtly art. Example: the art at the court of Louis XIV also has a precisely defined function. It is representational and serves the glory of the prince and the self-portrayal of courtly society. Courtly art is part of the life praxis of courtly society, just as sacred art is part of the life praxis of the faithful. Yet the detachment from the sacral tie is a first step in the emancipation of art. Emancipation is being used here as a descriptive term, as referring to the process by which art constitutes itself as a distinct social subsystem. The difference from sacred art becomes particularly apparent in the realm of production. The artist produces as an individual and develops a consciousness of the uniqueness of his activity. Reception, on the other hand, remains collective, but the content of the collective performance is no longer sacral, it is sociability. C. Only to the extent that the bourgeoisie adopts concepts of value held by the aristocracy does bourgeois art have a representational function. When it is genuinely bourgeois, this art is the objectification of the self-understanding of the bourgeois class. Production and reception of the self-understanding as articulated in art are no longer tied to the praxis of life. Habermas calls this the satisfaction of residual needs, that is, of needs that have become submerged in the life praxis of bourgeois society. Not only production, but reception also are now individual acts. The solitary absorption in the work is the adequate mode of appropriation of creations removed from the life praxis of the bourgeois, even though they still claim to interpret that praxis. In aestheticism, finally, where bourgeois art reaches the stage of self-reflection, this claim is no longer made. Apartness from the praxis of life, which had always been the condition that characterized the way art functioned in bourgeois society, now becomes its content. The typology we have sketched here can be represented in the accompanying tabulation. The vertical lines in boldface refer to a decisive change in the development, the broken ones to a less decisive one. There's a little graph here, I'll just give you a look at it. You can obviously pause and take a closer look. Sacred art is culture. Production, collective crafts, reception of sacred art is collective, sacred, courtly art. Purpose of function is representational object. The production is individual. The reception is collective, sociable. Bourgeois art, the purpose of function is portrayal of bourgeois self-understanding. Production is individual. Reception, individual. The tabulation allows one to notice that the development of the categories was not synchronous. Production by the individual that characterizes art in bourgeois society has its origins as far back as courtly patronage. But courtly art still remains integral to the praxis of life, although as compared with the cult function, the representational function constitutes a step toward a mitigation of claims that art plays a direct social role. The reception of courtly art also remains collective, although the content of the collective performance has changed. As regards reception, it is only with bourgeois art that a decisive change sets in. Its reception is won by isolated individuals. The novel is that literary genre in which the new mode of reception finds the form appropriate to it. The advent of bourgeois art is also the decisive turning point as regards use or function. Although in different ways, both sacral and courtly art are integral to the life praxis of the recipient. As cult and representational objects, works of art are put to a specific use. This requirement no longer applies to the same extent to bourgeois art. In bourgeois art, the portrayal of bourgeois self-understanding occurs in a sphere that lies outside the praxis of life. The citizen who, in everyday life, has been reduced to a partial function, means-ends activity, can be discovered in art as human being. Here, one can unfold the abundance of one's talents, though with the proviso that this sphere remains strictly separate from the praxis of life. Seen in this fashion, the separation of art from the praxis of life becomes the decisive characteristic of the autonomy of bourgeois art, a fact that the tabulation does not bring out adequately. To avoid misunderstandings, it must be emphasized once again that autonomy in this sense defines the status of art in bourgeois society, but that no assertions concerning the contents of works are involved. Although art as an institution may be considered fully formed toward the end of the 18th century, the development of the contents of works is subject to a historical dynamics, whose terminal point is reached in aestheticism, where art becomes the content of art. The European avant-garde movements can be defined as an attack on the status of art in bourgeois society. What is negated is not an earlier form of art, a style, but art as an institution that is unassociated with the life praxis of men. When the avant-gardists demand that art becomes practical once again, they do not mean that the contents of works of art should be socially significant. The demand is not raised at the level of the contents of individual works. Rather, it directs itself to the way art functions in society, a process that does as much to determine the effect that works have as does the particular content. The avant-gardist view its dissociation from the praxis of life as the dominant characteristic of art in bourgeois society. One of the reasons this dissociation was possible is that asceticism had made the elements that defines art as an institution the essential content of works. Institution and work contents had to coincide to make it logically possible for the avant-garde to call art into question. The avant-gardists proposed the sublation of art. Sublation in the Hegelian sense of the term. Art was not to be simply destroyed, but transferred to the praxis of life where it would be preserved, albeit in a changed form. The avant-gardists thus adopted an essential element of aestheticism that had made the distance from the praxis of life the content of works. The praxis of life to which aestheticism refers and which it negates is the means-ends rationality of the bourgeois everyday. Now, it is not the aim of the avant-gardists to integrate art into this praxis. On the contrary, they assent to the aestheticists' rejection of the world and its means-ends rationality. What distinguishes them from the latter is the attempt to organize a new life praxis from a basis in art. In this respect also, aestheticism turns out to have been the necessary precondition of the avant-gardist intent. Only an art, the contents of whose individual works is wholly distinct from the bad praxis of the existing society can be the center that can be the starting point for the organization of a new life praxis. With the help of Herbert Marcuse's theoretical formulations concerning the twofold character of art in bourgeois society, sketched in Chapter 1, the avant-gardist intent can be understood with particular clarity. All those needs that cannot be satisfied in everyday life, because the principle of competition pervades all spheres, can find a home in art, because art is removed from the praxis of life. Values such as humanity, joy, truth, solidarity are extruded from life, as it were, and preserved in art. In bourgeois society, art has a contradictory role. It projects the image of a better world and to that extent protests against the bad order that prevails. But by realizing the image of a better world and order in fiction, which is semblance only, it relieves the existing society of the pressure of those forces that make for change. They are assigned to confinement in an ideal sphere. Where art accompanies this, it is affirmative in Marcuse's sense of the term. If the twofold character of art in bourgeois society consists in the fact that the distance from the social production and reproduction process contains an element of freedom and an element of the non-committal and an absence of any consequences, it can be seen that the avant-gardist attempt to reintegrate art into the life process is itself a profoundly contradictory endeavor. For the relative freedom of art vis-à-vis the praxis of life is at the same time the condition that must be fulfilled if there is to be a critical cognition of reality. An art no longer distinct from the praxis of life but wholly absorbed in it will lose the capacity to criticize it, along with its distance. During the time of the historical avant-garde movements, the attempt to do away with the distance between art and life still had all the pathos of historical progressiveness on its side. But in the meantime, the culture industry has brought about the false elimination of the distance between art and life. This also allows one to recognize the contradictoriness of the avant-gardist undertaking. In what follows, we will outline how the intent to eliminate art as an institution found expression in the three areas that we used above to characterize autonomous art: purpose or function, production, reception. Instead of speaking of the avant-gardist work, we will speak of avant-gardist manifestation. A Dadaist manifestation does not have work character, but is nonetheless an authentic manifestation of the artistic avant-garde. This is not to imply that the avant-gardists produce no works whatever and replace them by ephemeral events. We will see that whereas they did not destroy it, the avant-gardists profoundly modified the category of the work of art. Of the three areas, the intended purpose or function of the avant-gardist manifestation is most difficult to define. In the aestheticist work of art, the disjointure of the work and the praxis of life characteristic of the status of art in bourgeois society has become the work's essential content. It is only as a consequence of this fact that the work of art becomes its own end in the full meaning of the term. In aestheticism, the social functionlessness of art becomes manifest. The avant-gardist artist counters such functionlessness not by an art that would have consequences within the existing society, but rather by the principle of the sublation of art in the praxis of life. But such a conception makes it impossible to define the intended purpose of art. For an art that has been reintegrated into the praxis of life, not even the absence of a social purpose can be indicated, as was still possible in aestheticism. When art and the praxis of life are one, when the praxis is aesthetic and art is practical, art's purpose can no longer be discovered because the existence of two distinct spheres, art and the praxis of life, that is constitutive of the concepts of purpose or intended use, has come to an end. We have seen that the production of the autonomous work of art is the act of an individual. The artist produces as individual, individuality not being understood as the expression of something, but as radically different. The concept of genius testifies to this. The quasi-technical consciousness of the makeability of works of art that aestheticism attains seems only to contradict this. Valéry, for example, demystifies artistic genius by reducing it to psychological motivations on the one hand, and the availability to it of artistic means on the other. While pseudo-romantic doctrines of inspiration thus come to be seen as the self-deception of producers, the view of art for which the individual is the creative subject is let stand. Indeed, Valéry's theorem concerning the force of pride, orgueil, that sets off and propels the creative process renews once again the notion of the individual character of artistic production central to art in bourgeois society. In its most extreme manifestations, the avant-garde's reply to this is not the collective as the subject of production, but the radical negation of the category of individual creation. When Duchamp signs mass-produced objects, a urinal, a bottle dryer, and sends them to art exhibits, he negates the category of individual production. See illustration. The signature, whose very purpose it is to mark what is individual in the work, that it owes its existence to this particular artist, is inscribed on an arbitrarily chosen mass product, because all claims to individual creativity are to be mocked. There's just a photo of the urinal. Duchamp's provocations not only unmasks the art market, where the signature means more than the quality of the work, it radically questions the very principle of art in bourgeois society, according to which the individual is considered the creator of the work of art. Duchamp's ready-mades are not works of art but manifestations. Not from the form-content totality of the individual object Duchamp signs can one infer the meaning, but only from the contrast between mass-produced object on the one hand and signature and art exhibit on the other. It is obvious that this kind of provocation cannot be repeated indefinitely. The provocation depends on what it turns against. Here, it is the idea that the individual is the subject of artistic creation. Once the signed bottle dryer has been accepted as an object that deserves a place in a museum, the provocation no longer provokes. It turns into its opposite. If an artist today signs a stovepipe and exhibits it, that artist certainly does not denounce the art market, but adapts to it. Such adaptation does not eradicate the idea of individual creativity, it affirms it, and the reason is the failure of the avant-gardist intent to sublate art. Since now the protest of the historical avant-garde against art as institution is accepted as art, the gesture of protest of the neo-avant-garde becomes inauthentic. Having been shown to be irredeemable, the claim to be protest can no longer be maintained. This fact accounts for the arts and crafts impression that works of the avant-garde not infrequently convey. The avant-garde not only negates the category of individual production, but also that of individual reception. The reactions of the public during a Dada manifestation where it has been mobilized by provocation, and which can range from shouting to fisticuffs, are certainly collective in nature. True, these remain reactions, responses to a preceding provocation. Producer and recipient remain clearly distinct, however active the public may become. Given the avant-gardist intention to do away with art as a sphere that is separate from the praxis of life, it is logical to eliminate the antithesis between producer and recipient. It is no accident that both Sarra's instructions for the making of a Dadaist poem and Breton's for the writing of automatic texts have the character of recipes. This represents not only a polemical attack on the individual creativity of the artist. The recipe is to be taken quite literally as suggesting a possible activity on the part of the recipient. The automatic texts also should be read as guides to individual production. But such production is not to be understood as artistic production, but as part of a liberating life praxis. This is what is meant by Breton's demand that poetry be practiced, pratiquer la poésie. Beyond the coincidence of a producer and recipient that this demand implies, there is the fact that these concepts lose their meaning. Producers and recipients no longer exist. All that remains is the individual who uses poetry as an instrument for living one's life as best one can. There is also a danger here to which surrealism at least partially succumbed, and that is solipsism, the retreat to the problems of the isolated subject. Breton himself saw this danger and envisaged different ways of dealing with it. One of them was the glorification of the spontaneity of the erotic relationship. Perhaps the strict group discipline was also an attempt to exorcise the danger of solipsism that surrealism harbors. In summary, we note that the historical avant-garde movements negate those determinations that are essential in autonomous art. The disjunction of art and the praxis of life, individual production, and individual reception as distinct from the former. The avant-garde intends the abolition of autonomous art, by which it means that art is to be integrated into the praxis of life. This has not occurred and presumably cannot occur in bourgeois society unless unless it be as a false sublation of autonomous art. Pulp fiction and commodity aesthetics prove that such a false sublation exists. A literature whose primary aim is to impose a particular kind of consumer behavior on the reader is in fact practical, though not in the sense the avant-gardists intended. Here, literature ceases to be an instrument of emancipation and becomes one of subjection. Similar comments could be made about commodity aesthetics that treat form as mere enticement, designed to prompt purchasers to buy what they do not need. Here also, art becomes practical, but it is an art that enthralls. This brief allusion will show that the theory of the avant-garde can also serve to make us understand popular literature and commodity aesthetics as forms of a false sublation of art as institution. In late capitalist society, intentions of the historical avant-garde are being realized, but the result has been a disvalue. Given the experience of the false sublation of autonomy, one will need to ask whether a sublation of the autonomy status can be desirable at all, whether the distance between art and the praxis of life is not requisite for that free space within which alternatives to what exists become conceivable. Chapter 4. The Avant-Gardist Work of Art. 1. On the problem of the category work. The use of the concept work of art when applied to products of the avant-garde is not without its problems. It might be objected that the crisis of the concept work that was touched off by the avant-garde movements is being obscured, and that the discussion therefore rests on false premises. Quote, the dissolution of the traditional unity of the work can be shown in a perfectly formal fashion to be the common characteristic of modernism. The coherence and autonomy of the work are deliberately called into question or even methodically destroyed, end quote. One cannot but agree with this comment by Bürger, but does that mean that one must conclude that aesthetics today has to dispense with the concept work? For that is how Bürger justifies his turning back to the Kantian aesthetics as today's only relevant one. First, we must ask ourselves what it is that has entered a crisis, the category work, or a specific historical form of that category. Quote, today, the only works which really count are those Today, the only works which really count are those which are no longer works at all, end quote. This enigmatic sentence of Adorno's still makes use of the concept of work in a twofold sense. In the general sense, and in that sense, modern art still has the character of work, and then in the sense of organic work of art, Adorno speaks of the rounded work. In this latter limited concept of work is in fact destroyed by the avant-garde. We must thus distinguish between a general meaning of the concept work and the differing historical instantiations. Generally speaking, the work of art is to be defined as the unity of the universal and the particular. Although the work of art is not conceivable if this unity is not present, unity was achieved in widely varying ways during different periods in the history of art. In the organic, symbolic work of art, the unity of the universal and the particular is posited without mediation. In the non-organic, allegorical work to which the works of the avant-garde belong, the unity is a mediated one. Here, the element of unity is withdrawn to an infinite distance, as it were. In the extreme case, it is the recipient who creates it. Adorno correctly emphasizes, quote, even where art insists on the greatest degree of dissonance and disharmony, its elements are also those of unity. Without it, they would not even be dissonant, end quote. The avant-gardist work does not negate unity as such, even if the Dadaists had such intentions, but a specific kind of unity, the relationship between part and whole that characterizes the organic work of art. Theoreticians who considered the category work null and void could answer this argument by pointing out that in the historical avant-garde movements, Forms of activity were deployed that cannot be adequately subsumed under the category work. The Dadaist manifestations, for example, which made the provocation of the public their avowed aim. But what is involved in these manifestations is far more than the liquidation of the category work. It is the liquidation of art as an activity that is split off from the praxis of life that is intended. It must be observed that even in its extreme manifestations, the avant-garde movements refer to the category work by negation. It is only with reference to the category work of art, for example, that Duchamp's ready-mades make sense. When Duchamp puts his signature on mass-produced, randomly chosen objects and sends them to art exhibits, this provocation of art presupposes a concept of what art is. The fact that he signs the ready-mades contains a clear allusion to the category work. The signature that attests that the work is both individual and unique is here affixed to the mass-produced object. The idea of the nature of art as it has developed since the Renaissance, the individual creation of unique works, is thus provocatively called into question. The act of provocation itself takes the place of the work. But doesn't this make the category work redundant? Duchamp's provocation addresses itself to art as a social institution. Insofar as the work is part of that institution, the attack is also directed against it. But it is a historical fact that the avant-garde movements did not put an end to the production of works of art, and that the social institution that is art proved resistant to the avant-gardist attack. The contemporary aesthetic can no more neglect the incisive changes that the historical avant-garde movements effected in the realm of art than it can ignore that art has long since entered a post-avant-gardist phase. We characterize that phase by saying that it revived the category of work and that the procedures invented by the avant-garde with anti-artistic intent are being used for artistic ends. This must not be judged a betrayal of the aims of the avant-garde movements, sublation of art as a social institution, uniting life and art, but the results of a historical process that can be described in those very general terms. Now that the attack of the historical avant-garde movements on art as an institution has failed, and art has not been integrated into the praxis of life, art as an institution continues to survive as something separate from the praxis of life. But the attack did make art recognizable as an institution and also revealed its relative inefficacy in bourgeois society as its principle. All art that is more recent than the historical avant-garde movements must come to terms with this fact in bourgeois society. It can either resign itself to its autonomous status or organize happenings to break through that status. But without surrendering its claim to truth, art cannot simply deny the autonomy status and pretend that it has a direct effect. The category work is not merely given a new lease on life after the failure of the avant-gardist attempt to reintroduce art into the praxis of life. It is actually expanded. The objet trouvé is totally unlike the result of an individual production process, but a chance find, in which the avant-gardist intention of uniting art and the praxis of life took shape, is recognized today as a work of art. The objet trouvé thus loses its character as anti-art and becomes, in the museums, an autonomous work among others. Pardon me. Just give me a minute. No hot in here. The revival of art as an institution and the revival of the category work suggests that today, the avant-garde is already historical. Even today, of course, attempts are made to continue the tradition of the avant-garde movements. That this concept can be put on paper without being a conspicuous oxymoron shows again that the avant-garde has become historical. But these attempts, such as the happenings, for example, which could be called neo-avant-gardist, can no longer attain the protest value of Dadaist manifestations, even though they may be prepared and executed more perfectly than the former. In part, this is owing to the avant-gardists' effects having lost their shock value. Some neo-avant-garde work. But it is probably more consequential that the sublation of art that the avant-gardists intended, its return to the praxis of life, did not in fact occur. In a changed context, the resumption of avant-gardist intentions with the means of avant-gardism can no longer even have the limited effectiveness the historical avant-gardes achieved. To the extent that the means by which the avant-gardists hoped to bring about the sublation of art have attained the status of works of art, the claim that the praxis of life is to be renewed can no longer be legitimately connected with their employment. To formulate more pointedly, the neo-avant-garde institutionalizes the avant-garde as art and thus negates genuinely avant-gardist intentions. This is true independently of the consciousness artists have of their activity, a consciousness that may perfectly well be avant-gardist. It is the status of their products, not the consciousness artists have of their activity, that defines the social effects of works. Neo-avant-gardist art is autonomous art in the full sense of the term, which means that it negates the avant-gardist intention of returning art to the praxis of life. And the efforts to sublate art become artistic manifestations that, despite their producers' intentions, take on the character of works. To speak of a revival of the category work after the failure of the historical avant-garde movements is not without its problems. The impression might be created that the avant-garde movements have no decisive significance for the further development of art in bourgeois society. The opposite is the case. Although the political intentions of the avant-garde movement's reorganizations of the praxis of life through art were never realized, their impact in the realm of art can hardly be overestimated. Here, the avant-garde does indeed have a revolutionary effect, especially because it destroys the traditional concept of the organic work of art and replaces it by another, which we must now seek to understand. 2. The new. Adorno's aesthetische theory is not conceived as a theory of the avant-garde, but lays claim to greater generality. Yet Adorno's point of departure is the insight that the art of the past can be understood only in the light of modern art. It therefore makes sense to examine the important section on modernism and to try to discover whether the categories used there can help us understand the avant-gardist work of art. Central to Adorno's theory of modern art is the category of the new. Adorno is perfectly aware, of course, that the objections can be raised in the use of this category, and sets out to refute them from the start. Quote, "In an essentially non-traditionalist society, the bourgeois, aesthetic tradition is a priori questionable. The authority of the new is that of the historically ineluctable." End quote. Quote, "It, the concept of modernism, does not negate earlier artistic exercises as styles have always done. However, it negates tradition as such. To that extent, it ratifies the bourgeois principle in art. This abstractness is linked to the commodity character of art." End quote. Adorno sees the new as a category of modern art as something distinct from the renewal of themes, motifs, and artistic techniques that also marked the development of art before the advent of modernism. He does this because he feels that the category is grounded in the hostility to tradition typical of bourgeois capitalist society. What this means, Adorno has explained elsewhere. Quote, "All bourgeois society stands under the law of exchange, of the like for like, of calculations which leave no remainder. By its very nature, exchange is something atemporal, like the ratio itself. But this means no less than that memory, time, and recollection are liquidated as a kind of irrational remnant. End quote. To begin with, we will attempt to clarify Adorno's thought for ourselves by some examples. Newness as an aesthetic category existed long before modernism, even as a program. The courtly Menesinger presented himself with the claim that he was singing a new song. The authors of the French tragicomedy state that they are meeting the public's need for nouveauté. Yet in both cases, we are dealing with something different from the claim to newness of modern art. In the case of the courtly poet and his new song, not only the theme, but also an abundance of individual motifs already exist. Newness here means variation within the very narrow, defined limits of a genre. In French tragicomedy, themes can be invented, but a typical plot line exists, which makes the sudden turn of the action. Example, a person diagnosed as dead turns out to be still alive, the identifying characteristic of the genre. The tragicomedy that comes close to what was later called popular literature already accommodates at the structural level the public's desire for shock-like effects, surprise. Newness becomes a calculated effect. There is, finally, a third kind of newness that the Russian formalists propose to elevate to a developmental law of literature, the renewal of literary techniques within a sequence of works of a literary genre. The mechanical technique, i.e., the technique that is no longer perceived as form, and that therefore no longer conveys a new view of reality, is replaced by a new one that can accomplish this until it too becomes mechanical and must be replaced in turn. In all three cases, what is referred to as newness differs fundamentally from what Adorno means when he uses the concept to characterize modernism. For here, we have neither a variation within the narrow limits of a genre, the new song, nor a schema that guarantees surprise effects, tragicomedy, or the renewal of literary techniques in works of a given genre. We are dealing not with development, but with a break with tradition. What distinguishes the category of the new in modernism from earlier, perfectly legitimate uses of the same category is the radical quality of the break with what had prevailed heretofore. It is no longer artistic techniques or stylistic principles which were valid heretofore, but the entire tradition of art that is negated. This is precisely the point where Adorno's use of the category the new must be challenged, for Adorno tends to make the historically unique break with tradition that is defined by the historical avant-garde movements the developmental principle of modern art as such. Quote, the acceleration in the replacement of aesthetic programs and schools at which the Philistine smirks because he considers them fads comes from the incessantly intensifying compulsion to reject which Valéry was the first to observe, end quote. Adorno knows, of course, that newness is the brand that identifies the eternally identical consumption goods offered the buyer. His argument becomes problematic where he claims that art appropriates the brand of consumer goods. Quote, it is only by assimilating its imagery to the autonomy of his poetry that Baudelaire reaches beyond a heteronymous market. Modernism is art through mimetic adaptation to what is hardened and alienated, end quote. Here, at the latest, Adorno pays for his failure to precisely historicize the category of the new. Since he neglects to do so, he must derive it directly from the commodity society. For Adorno, the category of the new in art is a necessary duplication of what dominates the commodity society. Since that society can survive only if the goods that are produced are also sold, it becomes necessary to constantly lure the buyer with the appeal of the newness of products has. According to Adorno, art also submits to this compulsion, and in a dialectical reversal, he claims to recognize the resistance to society and the very adaptation to the law that governs it. But it must be borne in mind that in this commodity society, the